righteousness. And it says if there's somebody that has an ought against you, not you against
Mm.
them, but even just so that that point of reconciliation.
Christian, I
With
think,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Heather.
I was just going to say, I think judgment implies a certain level of power, or in some cases, a self-perceived power, whether it's righteous judgment or unrighteous judgment. Um, so for me, when I think about the opposite of judgment, the word that comes to mind is humility. And in righteous judgment, I think humility plays a pretty significant role in being able to discern the righteousness of um, the needs that are required in that moment. So humility is a big piece of it in my mind.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate especially you bringing in the power dynamic
Yeah.
component. I think that's important too, and that would probably play out differently depending. Um, Even if you were the one with lesser power and you were sort of judging the one above, it's in some ways it's your attempt to kind of push back maybe. And ultimately that might buy you some space, but will it buy you the fullness? You know, I'm just, as you were talking, I was thinking about this. I was thinking a little bit about Howard Thurman's little book, Jesus and the Disinherited, where he talks about the strategies that the disinherited, and he's talking here about African American community who's been living at the time under segregation, the kinds of strategies they come up with to deal with that, and that they do allow them to survive, but at a significant cost. Right. And he goes through these three, I think it's like anger. um there's two others. I feel like it's like anger, fear, and dishonesty or deception or something like that. um all right, well, I have put us on live YouTube, and I'm going to go ahead and move us towards our time together. Thank you so much for this great opening conversation. Let's see here. I am not sure why. Nope, that's incorrect. I just shared you. I don't know why, but oh, there we go. Okay. Okay. Here we go. All right. Okay, so we have gone through our question. Just to sort of remind us where we are, we're in chapter 6, which is sort of in a broad section leading up to about chapter 9, just described typically as the Galilee ministry. And chapters 5 and 6 are, they kind of constitute to some extent their own section, in particular, chapter 5 up to 6, verse 19. So we're going to kind of conclude, and that's a section that is one of the unique things about it. It does fit in with the whole rest of the section 5 to 9 being kind of somewhere in the Galilee. But this section 5 up to about 19, the thing that's sort of interesting is the way that Luke oftentimes introduces the different episodes, right? It's not always clear what the timing is. He'll often say once when Jesus was doing this. Sometimes he'll give a placement, at other times he won't. And so there's, sort of, he's kind of pulled back a little bit. So he's not as concerned, at least in that regard. But I think as we move further in now, we get a little bit more of this. And once we hit verse 20, we really are going to actually start for the first time getting chunks of Jesus's teaching. So I think this is one of the important things to note thus far is we've gotten a lot about Jesus, about who he is, about what he is about and what he does, but we have not gotten sort of these large chunks of his teaching ministry. And that's what's going to happen starting in verse 20 when we turn to Luke's sermon, his kind of rendition of the Sermon on the Mount, which is often called the Sermon on the Plain. Okay, so let's get started. If I could get a volunteer who is willing to read
I will.
our
I'll
first.
start
Okay.
us.
All right, great. Thank you, Diane.
Now during those days, he went out to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God. And when the day came, he called his disciples and chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles: Simon, whom he named Peter, and his brother Andrew, and James, and John, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, what is that? And
Alphaeus.
Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. He came down with them and stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. They had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured. And all in the crowd were trying to touch him, for power came out from him, and he healed them all.
Okay. All right. So the first part, I've kind of broken this into two sections, with the first paragraph and then the second, because clearly the first paragraph is sort of a unit unto itself. It's the calling of, it's sort of Luke's account of the calling of the disciples. There's a couple of things to just note here. I'll kind of read through, first of all, verse 12. Now, during those days, he went out to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God. So the first thing just to note is that this is another indication in Luke that whenever prayer happens, something significant is about to come after it, right? And so that is certainly the case here. And the thing that is significant, of course, here is the choosing of the disciples. And so I think that it's not just, though, and I think Luke's trying to make something of a point for us, both about Jesus, but also about the life of discipleship, right? Because that's the ultimate sort of call, is for us to try to follow Jesus, right? To figure out, what does it mean for us to follow Jesus, to do what Jesus did, to live our lives in some sense in the way that he did in our time and space. And so the first thing then that really is significant is that if it is the case, and I think we can say that that is indeed the case throughout the Gospel of Luke, and probably even into Acts, if it is the case, especially though that that Jesus is constantly shown as being in prayer, and that always precedes another significant event in his story, it becomes an indication that part of what shaped Jesus's life was his commitment to doing his Father's will, right? To doing the will of God. Now, I know most of you are probably, I would assume, at least the conversations that we've had, and so you can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, you're somewhere in the Trinitarian camp, right? Where you have come to realize or come to believe and affirm that Jesus is God, right? That he is fully God and fully human. And so this raises the question, right, of, well, what does this mean, right? So there's this bigger metaphysical, I suppose, question here, and that intersects with the life of Jesus. But I think we might want to bracket some of that out and set it to the side without necessarily denying that that's the fact, and say that what this indicates is that part of what it means to be a faithful covenant partner is to be completely reliant on one who is beyond you, right? I mean, that's, in a sense, that's what Jesus is about in his ministry, right? He has come to announce God's year of favor, God's year of Jubilee. He spends his time, right, going around teaching and preaching Power flows out from him, etc. He's going to be teaching here in just a few minutes, and we're going to hear some extraordinary things. Well, the indication in these little vignette moments is that he does this in obedience to his Father's will, and in a sense empowered by his Father and the Spirit. Right? Remember, that's one of the earlier things that we heard earlier on. This intense sense of Jesus being marked by the Spirit. He's baptized in the Spirit. The Spirit drives him out into the wilderness. He then comes back to Nazareth, and his opening first sermon says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." So all of that, anyway, is meant to indicate this deep sense of reliance. And I think that's important for us as we think about the life of discipleship. The other thing is, excuse me, I can't remember if this came up yesterday or it might have come up in a conversation I had with someone, but it's this sense that we want to have all of it given to us at once. Our human desire is to have everything sort of figured out. And we think, hey, if we get everything figured out all at once at the very beginning, from then on out, everything will just kind of unfold. But what we see even in the life of Jesus is that he has to constantly go back to God. And I do think we could take from this that Jesus himself is entering into the act of discernment, right? It takes time to discern what God's will is, right? So it takes time for him to pray and to communicate and to connect with God and to sense God's leading in choosing, right, in affirming those who have chosen to follow him, certainly in this particular episode. And so anyway, the fact that prayer comes up again and again in the life of Jesus, not just that it comes up, but that it comes up again and again, also indicates its significance for the whole of his life, and the fact that it takes time. It takes time to follow God. It takes time to grow in God's will. It takes time to become fully human. I mean, I think it's another way of thinking about this. And so on the one level, that means, you give yourself a break if you're the kind of person that's, your proclivity is to be really hard on yourself. On the other hand, if you really, really want to get it all figured out, it also requires a certain kind of patience and commitment, right? The Christian life is not a sprint, it's a marathon. It's a different sort of image. That's an image that Paul loved to use. So I think we could take these away here as highly practical, frankly. This little thing that's being told to us about Jesus and his own prayer life. Then we get the list of names, and we get a couple of descriptions in here. And I just want to highlight a couple of these here in just a second, but I'll read through the passage first. Starting in verse 13. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, and John, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James, son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. All right. So a few comments. So number one, the term disciple. This is a term in the Greek that was commonly used to describe students of a rabbi, right? And oftentimes, as we will find in Luke, there is a larger group of disciples, right? Which includes more than just these 12, but it's a designation that shows up here for the first time and then is going to appear again in other areas. And so one of the things that I like about this term is the German rendering of this term, I think, gets at the essence of this. It's called Nachfolge, and it literally means following after. So when I think about what does it mean to be a disciple, I tend to think about sort of that German rendering as probably a really catching the spirit, in a sense, of one who tries to follow after. And this is true because I remember there was a story that a pastor shared And it was sort of a parable that said, it was like this idea that once you became a student of a rabbi, which was very hard to do, you had to make it through several levels over the course of your young life, to the point where it seemed like, okay, the rabbis would interview you, and the question they were asking is, can this kid do what I do? Can they really master Torah and extend my teaching, and themselves become rabbis? And if you did make it to that place, you spent your time typically following the rabbi around, right? Most rabbis were not sedentary. Like teachers generally in the ancient world, they were peripatetic, which means that they were walking teachers. They would go from place to place oftentimes. And there was a saying, so you imagine yourself on the road, and whatever it is that your rabbi walks through, you walk right behind them. So if your rabbi is walking through mud or dust or somehow steps on dung, you're going to do the same, right? Because you're trying literally to become like your rabbi, right? Because eventually you want to become a rabbi. And a saying developed, said, maybe you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. And that was sort of the image, right, of being a disciple as one who is trying to imitate their teacher. So that word being used here in reference to the people who become the devotees, the followers of Jesus, has a lot of deep resonance, and also a wider history than just Christian sort of theology. The second thing, of course, is the fact that Jesus chooses 12, right? Here at the beginning, at least. And I think this has the symbolic meaning of the 12 tribes of Israel, right? And this is something that shows up again and again in the New Testament, of a sense that God is renewing and reconstituting the whole of Israel, right? Not just the tribe of Judah and Ephraim, right, which would have been the tribes located in Judea, right, in a sense, but also the tribes that have been lost, right, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom, who were, when they were invaded by Assyria, they were scattered. So the idea is the reconstitution of the tribes of Israel, and this, in a sense, is what makes the 12 unique. And this is another thing that I think is interesting for Christians to think about, because it's not just the 12 that are disciples. You and I and others at our church and other churches are also disciples, right? But what makes this group unique, of course, is that they are the 12. They do have a special role, and of course they are witnesses to the life of Jesus. So there is a kind of uniqueness that coheres with these figures, but there's also a commonality that even we who live some 2,000 years later have with them, and we need to keep that in mind. I would also say that commonality extends to the third term that I think is important to highlight, and that's the term apostle. So apostle is a term that we also have often used only to designate these figures. There are some church traditions who have retained the use of the term apostle. And of course, in the early church, actually, we see extensive evidence of the use of the term apostle. So I don't think the early church was thinking that way, but I know I grew up hearing about the 12 apostles, and the idea was that only they were apostles. Well, that's not true, not only historically, but I don't think that's true theologically. And the reason is that the word apostle simply means one who is sent, right? And I think that also then becomes another element in what is the disciple, like what is the character profile that Jesus is imagining. He's imagining people who are genuinely trying to follow after him, but also are genuinely commissioned to go forth into the world. So the sentness of the Christian life, and maybe we could even say of the church, is something that doesn't just have to do with these 12, who do, in fact, obviously go out into the world after the death and resurrection of Jesus. empowered by the Spirit. But that too is our call, right? Our call is also to be those who are sent. Now, sent where? That's part of the task, right? Of discerning where is God sending you. It may be very localized. It may even be to only your family or to those who live near you. But there is still a sense of being on a journey, right? Of being sent forth into the world, of not just existing as a community for ourselves. And then the last one to highlight is the sense of chosen, right? It's and this I think is also important in a tradition like ours, where we emphasize free will, the free response, the freedom of conscience, right? Which I talked a little bit about yesterday, all of which I think are very important. But there is a sense in which God initiates. And I would tend to argue that there's a kind of divine priority and a human subsequence, right? That God initiates relationship with us. God is the one who kind of, tries to draw us to God's self. Jesus is the one who tries to draw us to Jesus, right? To himself. And so that's where I think this language of chosenness can work. Where it can become toxic, of course, and this is why I'm trying to be very careful with this, is when we start kind of walking around saying, well, I'm chosen, I'm chosen, and that means other people are not chosen, right? Or maybe, this works really well in Minnesota, I'm the frozen chosen, right? Typically, that's how we describe the Presbyterians. But so the language of chosenness, though, does have a kind of toxic, and my apologies to my Presbyterian friends on the screen, by the way. I'm sure you've heard that phrase, though, before. But that this moniker of being chosen does have a history of being becoming toxic in the life of the church and in other ways that I won't go into. But I don't think we need to get rid of it altogether. We just need to interpret it, in a way that's perhaps more proper. And what I would say with that is that there is a sense that the relationship and even the life of the disciple is one that starts in God, not in us, right? God is the one that initiates. God is the one that draws to us. And I mean, even the life of prayer that Jesus is exemplifying gives us that sensibility, right? So here, of course, we have the very specific sense of Jesus setting these people apart, authorizing them, and then, of course, giving them a kind of unique role. And it is true that these 12 in particular do seem to have a very unique role, not only in the telling of the story of Jesus, but once we get into things like the visionary scenes, say in the book of Revelation, the 12 apostles, in a sense, are seated on 12 thrones, right? So they have a unique role that is not necessarily like ours. The last thing to note is that there are some discrepancies between the list that we have in Matthew and Mark and Luke in terms of names. The large majority, I think it's at least 10 of the names overlap, but there are 2 names where they're a little different. There might be some ways to resolve it, but I just note that's there. So, because I'm sure some of you may have read those other passages. All right, let me stop. I've given you some stuff to think about here and just see if there's some comments or questions before we hit the second paragraph.
Christian?
Yeah.
He talks about here about choosing the 12 seemingly out of a larger group. I've always had the impression before he picked these 12 and they're the ones that kind of followed him around and then they went on from there. But there were apparently a larger group that were following him, and then he picked the 12 as the apostles. Is that right?
Well, that's the feeling that Luke's telling gives. I think that's right. I think you get a sense that there's a smaller group maybe in some of the other Gospels. When I think about maybe Matthew's or John's telling, it feels like the 12 are sort of the first ones that come to him.
Yeah.
And there is some of that in Luke, right? Because we do have the story about Peter, and the catch of fish and all that stuff. But I think Luke is the one that also tells us about Jesus sending out 70, right, witnesses that we're going to hear about later. And you don't have that story in the other gospels. So I think Luke does have this feeling of there being a larger group and Jesus needing to discern then who is going to play this particular function of the 12 among his disciples. Good question. Thank you, Jeff. Any other comments or questions from folks? All right, so let me turn us into the next paragraph. And this is, I think, first of all, we can say this is a bit of a transitional paragraph in the story, because this is going to set us up into the next sort of big chunk, which is a major teaching section in Luke. So I'll just kind of read through this, and then I'm going to offer just 2 or 3 little thoughts on this. So first of all, starting in verse 17, he came down with them and stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. They had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured. And all in the crowd were trying to touch him, for power came out from him and healed all of them. Okay, so just a couple of things to note here. One is sort of because now we're back into sort of some of the things that Jesus does and what's the meaning of that. So the first is just this sense that he originally is on a mountain, which is what verse 12 tells us, and now he descends. And I think this is important because the material that we're about to hear, most of it you can find in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, right? And so if you think about Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, it's a highly organized, compact section, chapters 5 through 7. And so there's a lot of stuff in there. And Jesus really, in a sense, is configured as the new Moses, right? Because he starts out, in a sense, by reinterpreting the law to the people. Here again, Luke kind of echoes this, because this sort of looks a little bit like, or is sort of reminiscent of when Moses descends the mountain to talk to the people, right? And I think we can see here that Luke does imagine something similar. The only difference, of course, is the inversion, right? Jesus is no longer on a mountain. He's now on a level plain. And he, of course, is also going to come down and speak to them in some ways, not like Moses per se, but more like a prophet, which is a little bit different. And we'll get into that later on. So he descends from the mountain, right? From the cloud. And by the way, it's interesting, in the ancient world, mountains were so important. You can imagine why, because it's the place where the earth, right, gets close to touching the sky in sort of the kind of cosmography, right, of the way that people thought about heaven and earth. And so I have a friend of mine who said, in the ancient world, all the most important things happen somewhere on a mountain, And so here is Jesus, right? He's on a mountain. He's discerning. He's making decisions about who his company is going to be. And now he comes down to become almost like a fountain, right, of power, of God's power. And so that's sort of I think kind of the imagery here of having gone and been with God and now coming forth to give and to share what God has empowered him with. The second thing is just to note, Luke here offers to us that that there's a large crowd that has come from all over, right? Judea, Jerusalem, Tyre, and Sidon. And the reason that these names I think are specifically important is that all of them are outside of the Galilee region. So Jesus, the one thing we can say about this whole section is that Jesus is in the Galilee, and he's doing ministry, you know, intimate ministries in synagogues and things like that. But he's also started to draw interest from people from all over the place, right? So Judea, of course, is that's the wide description. Jerusalem, right, is the power center in terms of the Jewish, and Tyre and Sidon, I believe, are sort of a mixed Gentile area on the coast. So very basically meant to tell us that Jesus is drawing significant interest well beyond the region that he's in. And then in our last verse, it talks about all the crowd are trying to touch him, for power came out from him, and he healed all of them. What we have already seen and are going to continue to see, and are just being reminded of here, is that Jesus is the source of God's power, right? That Jesus, out of Jesus comes life, and in this case, it's very specific, you know, power to heal. But in just a minute, and here is sort of my next point, he is going to begin teaching, and that teaching is also meant to be understood as a source of the power of life, God's power. So this is, again, is a transitional paragraph meant to move us into the scene that follows. But before I move us there, are there any comments or questions that folks have?
Just that statement there, as opposed to Jesus' source of power is God. I don't know. It just seems interesting.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I suppose the way that you know, yeah, and we've kind of said that in the flow of this, Jesus has shown himself to be reliant upon God, right? So the source of his, right? But in terms of the experience that the people are having, just like with Moses, right? In a sense, they know where God is located in Jesus, right? In his life, in his ministry. And so that's what I mean, I think, with that phrase. He in a sense is the source of divine power there. Yeah. So like a fountain of God's power. Other comments or questions?
You could say it goes either way. Jesus is the source of God's power. God is the source of Jesus' power.
Amen. Amen. And I think both have to be said, right? We need to say both. That's sort of certainly what we see when we look at the whole narrative, but even just that little pericope where Jesus is in prayer, right? Searching for discernment, in a sense, right? The source of his strength is not himself, but someone else.
Right.
But in terms of the experience that the people are having, right? In a sense, God is working through that. All right, well, let's move to the next set of verses. This brings us into the sermon proper. So can I have a volunteer as one to read our passage?
I can. Then he looked up at his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven, for that is what their ancestors did to the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets.
Okay, quite a way to start off your ministry, right? Obviously, the Nazareth scene already has given us an indication of why Jesus might be controversial and how that controversy could lead to some bad things. We now get this opening salvo, right, of both blessings and woes. And the woes, by the way, are unique in a sense to Luke. They don't show up in Matthew. All right, so first of all, chapter 6. So we just read through these first 6 verses, but they're part of a larger section leading towards the end of the chapter up to verse 49. And the whole of this section does, for the most part, show up in Matthew, right? Matthew 5 through 7 and elsewhere. And the rest of the material, for instance, that's in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount shows up in other places in Luke. So it's not that Luke doesn't include it, it's just that it's not included in this particular sermon and scene. The difference, as I've already noted in a sense, is that Jesus is configured more as a prophet in Luke than as sort of the new Moses in some ways, and that becomes more and more evident, I think, as we move through. It certainly has been thus far in his way of moving around and his teaching and healing and whatnot. Like Matthew 5 through 7, this passage, like if you just memorized this section and you devoted your life to this portion of Scripture, you would not do bad in terms of trying to be a Christian. And I think I take that idea pretty much out of John Wesley and others. All right, I mean, Wesley, he was not necessarily about Luke chapter 6. He was more about Matthew 5 through 7. But the idea is that this is a kind of manifesto for the life of discipleship, right? This is the place where long time meditation and contemplation on these verses and on trying to live out what these verses talk about, in some sense, is at the heart of what it means to follow Jesus. And so I think it'd be fair to say it's also good in a sense, and this is probably why we get it at the very beginning of Jesus's teaching, right? So, as I said, this is the first time we get a really big chunk of Jesus's teaching, and the very beginning of it, right, is a kind of manifesto for how to follow, right? This also I think helps us with, say, Jeff's question earlier, and what we mentioned, which is the sense that there are a lot of people who are interested in Jesus, who are sort of trying to devote themselves or follow, and maybe even fall in the category of being disciples. And so Jesus now is going to give them words of life. All right. He's not just going to become a source of healing, of physical healing. He's now going to become a different kind of source through his teaching. So putting this into practice. And a lot of this, frankly, it's just going to devolve. I don't know if we want to say, or just kind of, if you boil it down, be merciful as God is merciful. That's what this is all going to come down to at the end. So the next thing, sort of broad thought here for verses 20 through 26, there's two things I think that are important to note. In Matthew, the Beatitudes, which is sort of the primary parallel here, all of the yous there are third person. So they're third person plural, and which means that they're sort of more generalized. They're kind of generalized statements. Whereas here, all of the yous here are in second person. They're still, I believe they're still plural, but they're in second person, which means that Jesus, in a sense, Luke has Jesus talking specifically to people in the crowd, right? So it's specifically addressed. It's not just a generalized statement like a kind of broad principle. It is specifically aimed at people who are listening. The second thing that I think is very important here and has oftentimes gotten, I would say gotten Christians maybe to some extent into trouble, or at least made it hard to figure out what to do with some of these verses. And that is that these are not imperatives. They are indicatives. Now, what does that mean? An imperative is a command. It's sort of a telling you to do something in order, and therefore something good will come from it, right? An indicative is simply a statement of fact, right? It's indicative. And so the second clause that I have here for you, these verses do not point to a human program, but rather to God's agenda, right? In other words, it's God who is going to reverse the situation of those who find themselves poor and hungry and weeping, right? Those who are reviled, right? So it's not an attempt to say that you have to take upon these postures in order to receive the rewards. It's really rather a broad scale statement that God's about to turn the current situation on its head, right? That the status quo in all of its injustice and pain and brokenness is not going to last in the face of God's coming righteousness. Right? That's kind of the basic sensibility. When we turn to these first verses of the blessings, number one is the term for blessing, makarios. This term particularly picks up on this idea of the indicative and the notion that something imminent is about to happen, because blessing carries with it a kind of eschatological connotation, right? Blessings are not just things that we that happen only in the now. In some sense, they constitute a taste of what is coming, right? It's almost like to experience a blessing in the here and now is to experience a taste of what God intends to do in the remaking of the world, right? The mending or the healing of the world. So this blessing language here, and I think blessing more generally in the Old and New Testament is not only about the moment, it's also about the future that presses into the moment, right? That God God is always in the process of moving us towards, that final redemption, that final reconciliation that we all long for, even if we have tasted of that, right? And coming into relationship with Jesus and experiencing the Spirit, we know it's not fully here yet, right? And it's that sense of something from the future pressing into now. So the situation right here it fits really well. Not only does it cohere, of course, with what we hear for the most part in Matthew, and I'll talk just briefly about the distinctions in just a second, but it also coheres really well with what we've already heard that Jesus is about, right? So if you remember, if we go back to chapter 4, right, Jesus stands up and he recites a text from Isaiah 61, right? That he is anointed with the Spirit to do what, right? To proclaim liberty to the captives, right? To bring healing to the broken, right? To those who are dispossessed, the outsiders, the poor, etc. So the language here coheres. It doesn't map on precisely, but it maps very, very closely. right? A deep sort of what we might call family resemblance here. So this makes sense in terms of everything that we've heard about who Jesus is and what he's about. And of course, it also then makes sense, I think, in dialogue with sort of the other gospels, which are slightly different in certain kinds of ways. So Luke, I think it's fair to say, imagines very specifically people who are really poor and really hungry, right? I think it includes, like, in other words, we don't get the spiritualizing like we get in Matthew, right? The poor in spirit, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, which are also, I think, important, clearly, because of what they talk about. But here, Luke has a very kind of tactile, embodied sensibility about what he's talking about. That God does not intend for people to barely eke by. That is not God's vision. That God's vision is that people should have access to a flourishing life, which means that their bodies, right, should also be cared for, right? So this notion of embodiment is very important. And so, as I state here, right, the poor who have nothing will receive God's peaceable kingdom, right? The kingdom of God is going to be theirs, right? The reign or rule of God is going to be theirs. And I think what that seems to me to intend, especially given the woes that are coming, is precisely a care for the body, right? Those who weep and those who are reviled, right? These can be read certainly as they are. I think the excluding, reviling, and defaming, obviously, those obviously fit into the context of persecution. The weeping is more just sadness, right? So we can take deep situations of deep sadness because of oppression and rejection, or perhaps otherwise. But I think the deep sadness sensibility, the deep kind of sense of brokenness over whatever the situation may be, it seems to me is also aimed at, along with the notion of a deep sadness connected to the experience of being oppressed and rejected, specifically as one tries to live out the commands. And you're gonna, when we get into these commands, like, I don't know if we're gonna make it into to all of them today, but this stuff is hard. Like, Jesus is like, love your enemies, and I've talked to a few people and they're like, I don't even have an enemy. And I'm like, wait a minute. I think the first thing you got to do is realize the people that maybe you have a hard time with and you don't like. and once, like, to do that is actually to take a step down this path, because once you say, okay, I struggle with liking this person, then you're ready, I think, in some ways, to figure out, what does it mean to love them. And if you're not willing to acknowledge that they might be there, well, you're not ready yet to learn how to love them, perhaps. So what's the notion? What's the idea? The rejected, those who are persecuted, will experience real joy, right? And the physical expression of that is laughter, right? Think about that. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh, right? And that laughter is the physical expression. And I think that should be then applied not only to that little short blessing in 21b, but also to the whole of 22. All right, blessed are you, because we don't hear what's going to happen to them necessarily. Well, I guess we do into verse 23, but it's that sense of deep joy and laughter as a component of that. And here, I think this is why I think to be a Christian is to sing. That song has always been woven into the Christian experience, like it is in other religious traditions. But in our tradition, it's typically been connected to joy, right? And so we have these poignant pictures of Paul in prison singing, right? And I think the early Christians were constantly singing, And so I think singing is this is what I think about when I think about kind of laughter and joy in the face of these problems, that is a sort of expression, a characteristic mark of a disciple and really of the church in a sense. Wow, it's already 11:22, and I said we're going to end early. So let me get us into the woes here, because I think that's about as. I'm sorry to end on such a depressing note, but such as it is. So first of all, let me just kind of read these. Verse 24. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets. All right, so the first thing before, and I don't have this up on the screen, the first thing I really would like to do for these verses is to contextualize them in terms of what I've been able to glean from several of the studies that I've read. And number one is the idea, again, that this is also an indicative set of statements, right? They're not necessarily imperatives. The imperatives are going to start in verse 27. So the commands, which can then, you could say, are given to both the people who've experienced hardship and the people who've experienced relatively easy life. They both are commanded, in a sense, starting in verse 27. What I think we can do here, though, is to see that this is simply the inverse side, that people have in a situation essentially of injustice in which not everyone has access to a flourishing life, right? People are poor and hungry, etc. Some people experience a rejection and even oppression. Some people are deeply sad, etc., because of these things. Well, there are other people who've had a really easy life, right? And that is also the idea is that no longer will the situations, the arrangements that have allowed you to keep suffering at bay be what will continue to go forward when God begins to right the world. You're going to have also your own trouble, I think is the way that most people. So in other words, most of the commentators that I have read do not see these as being super sharp judgment, so much as the situation is about to change and the arrangements of injustice will no longer allow you to keep at bay the things that you've been able to keep at bay. So that's just so you know, as a useful kind of interpretive, you can make of that what you will, because these are tough verses. And I think it'd be fair to say that most of us, in some ways, if we compare ourselves to the rest of the world, have had a relatively easier experience, like than someone living in a barrio in South America or something of that nature. So number one, in echo to Deuteronomy, right? The covenantal statements of blessings and woes. And I think this is included here. This gives us another one of these echoes of the Sinai event, which also then coheres with Matthew's sort of portrait of Jesus as the great teacher. The woes, of course, further intensify the reversal that's coming. And I think in some ways it probably lights a fire under the folks who might fall in verses 24 through 26 to listen even more carefully to the commandments that are going to come, right? So if the commandments are coming, that's a way to prepare yourself and begin to live out a different kind of life. Another underlying piece here that I think is really helpful, that also gets us kind of echoes with our question that we started with, which is, do not judge and you will not be judged. And I think I mentioned that part of what that I think carries with it, the meaning that carries with it, is do not use the standards of this world to dictate the way that you will respond to others, particularly your enemies. And you are going to see this throughout this section, right? Because typically, how would you treat your enemies? Right? You would treat them like an enemy. And Jesus is like, you have to love, you have to care for, you have to pray for, you have to go the extra mile, all that stuff. So you could say that these woes then fit in with that as well, right? That what the world celebrates and values is not what God celebrates and values, right? And I think and so here, the last statement to make, if these are indeed in second person, then that means that Jesus is actually addressing some people in the crowd for whom they've had a relatively easy life compared to their neighbors. And so you can well imagine how animosity, right, and hostility towards Jesus might have arisen, particularly among the cultural elite, alongside, of course, of the religious elite and the religious authorities. All right, let me stop there. I'm going to stop share of my screen and see what kinds of comments or questions you might have in our last couple of minutes here. Elgin, you're muted, buddy.
Story of my life. I'm a disciple. I'm sitting there, and Jesus does all this healing and stuff. I see that go on, and then he turns to me and my buddies, and he says, "You're blessed if you're poor." And he says, "You're the sorrows that await for you if you're rich." And then he goes through the other three things. If I'm a disciple and I hear that, I'm going to want to be poor. I'm a new kid with this group and whatever, and I'm going to want to do what he says. I mean, the idea that it goes on beyond that, if I'm just listening to it, I'm going to hear I want to be poor.
Yeah, so let me, and I mean, you've touched on why I think it's important to note that these are indicative and not imperative statements, right? And what I mean by that is indicative is simply, this is the situation that God's about to do. God's about to turn the world upside down.
But
But
he's
then,
talking to me.
oh yeah, he's talking to you, he's talking to me, he's talking to all of us. But, and this is where I apologize, we have to end today. This is where I think the significance of verse 27 and the way it starts. So he says, this is the situation. And then he's basically saying, this is what you can do in the light of it, no matter what your status is. Because he says, but I say to you that listen. Right? If you are listening, if you are really hearing, I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. Right? This is what, in a sense, in light of what's coming, this is the way to live. Right? So that becomes that should be understood. I think, at least this is the way I take it, that is telling all of us, regardless of our station and our situation, that that's the actual way to live. Right? The other statements are not imperatives. They are, and that's important because they don't say you need to become poor in order to be blessed. Like that's not the way it's stated. That's that difference. The place where you get the command, and the commands, I guess I should say, is flowing out of that, right? So, I mean, another way of saying it is, Jesus, could you just say it slightly differently? And he might have just said, you know what? God is about to reverse the world, which means that people on the top, you're not going to be on the top anymore. And people who've been crushed on the bottom, you're going to find relief. But you know what? Anyone who's listening, here's what you should do. You should love your enemies. You should pray for those who persecute you. That's the way I would read this section, as sort of a shorthand, as opposed to sort of a programmatic statement that requires you or tells you that you must be poor or strive to be that kind of poor in order to become these other things, because that's not the way it's actually framed. Now, poverty may be something that you experience, right? You may, and in fact, actually, Elgin, even if we are wealthy, I mean, think about there were people who were. I mean, Jesus himself is supported by wealthy women. And Joseph of Arimathea becomes part of the story, etc. Right? They too will wind up falling under these blessings because eventually they're going to be trying to follow Jesus. So they're going to fall into verse number 22. Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. So there is a doorway opened for everyone. Your status and your location are not ultimately determinative. You should, of course, know that what God values is not what the world values. And I think that's sort of the sort of main message of all this. And then the real program, if we want to say that there's some programmatic statements, that's what comes starting in verse 27. That at least is how I would sort of do a sort of thumbnail sketch to what I think Jesus is trying to do. I don't know if that's helpful or not, though. It's not.
Yeah.
Well, I love you, Algin. At least you're honest, right?
Find that really helpful.
Okay.
To me, it's just saying that's where I should put my emphasis. And I mean, I personally know how hard that is. I mean, I think there are people that I don't want to pray for, or I don't want to love. I mean, it's hard.
And truly, it is hard to pray for people that you deeply disagree with, and not to do it in a self-righteous way. Right? Like, Lord, I'm gonna pray for that person. They are on my last nerve. Like, that's not, I mean, I guess that's one way to start the prayer, but that's not the ultimate goal, probably, of that.
I pray they get hit by a truck.
Oh, Algin, God love you.
Christian, I have a simple question.
Yeah.
Is the Luke 6, is that the same as the Sermon on the Mount? Or is it a summary of the Sermon on the Mount, or is it something separate?
It's
what you call the Sermon on the Plain.
Yeah, it's overlap. It doesn't include everything from the Sermon on the Mount, but it certainly includes a lot.
So it happened in the same place?
Well, Luke is not as concerned with that, but he talks about there being a mountain, and he talks about Jesus coming down from that mountain. So I think the mountain geography, topography is particularly important to Matthew, and it's less important to Luke. But the content, in a sense of what they say, there is a tremendous amount of overlap. Luke, though, just does not include all of what Matthew has Jesus saying there, but it shows up in other places that Luke tells. So pretty much everything that you hear in the Sermon on the Mount, you're going to hear in the Gospel of Luke. You're just not going to hear it at the scene of the Sermon on the Plain.
And then in Luke, it sounds like Jesus picked the apostles / disciples out of the crowd, whereas in Matthew, he picked them, the same people, was as he was walking along the Sea of Galilee, and and so to me it sounds like he picked them differently in both those books.
That's right. Yeah, there's in Matthew, I think in the other Gospels, it feels like the disciples / apostles are to a certain extent the first people to sort of follow Jesus. As opposed to in Luke, there's some of that, because we do have the story about the miraculous catch of fish, right? We do have those stories, but then in the setting here, it feels like there's a discernment and a pulling out of the crowd.
Christian, in my notes, it says, this may be Luke's account of the sermon that Matthew records in Matthew 5:7, or it may be that Jesus gave similar sermons on several different occasions. Some believe that this was not one sermon, but a composite based on Jesus' customary teachings.
Yeah, I mean, I personally think that that's especially the case for the Sermon on the Mount. But the Sermon on the Mount is so highly structured that more than likely it is a composite of a bunch of the teachings of Jesus that he might have delivered, at different occasions, but then is compressed into a single scene. because all of those teachings also show up in Luke's gospel, but they're kind of sprinkled throughout the story. They don't just show up in a single place. So I tend to think that that's the correct way of thinking about it in terms of its composition. So for whatever, if that's helpful or not.
Sally, that would make sense because we know ministers repeat themselves.
That's true. I've said a lot of the same things. I'm sure you guys have gotten tired of hearing me say some of the same things again and again.
So Christian, now, part of the significance of saying that some of these were from Jerusalem and Judea could be such that the Galileans are the main core of the hungry and poor, whereas the Judeans and those from Jerusalem would be the rich.
Yeah, that's actually,
religious.
I think you that's right. I hadn't even thought about that. That could actually be what helps set this up, because, or at least that makes sense of sort of the material conditions of the people that would be listening, because the Galilee is not a wealthy area, from my understanding. And Jerusalem, of course, is identified as the power center. So you could quite possibly be correct around that.
And Sidon and
Major trading centers.
yeah,
Yeah,
so that-
economically flush. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great insight. All right, well, I am like 10 minutes late for my meeting.